How do we know we really have consent with a partner? What does it really look like? What does it sound like? There's a lot we need to learn and unpack to truly understand what consent really is. I'm Cheryl Michelle Bradshaw, and I am the author of Real Talk About Sex and Consent. And in this video, we're going to learn the basics of what consent really is. So the basics of consent start with legal. That is the absolute bare minimum. Obviously, without legal consent, nothing else matters. The main basics, this can change depending on where you live, but it has to be freely given. That means it can't be coerced, pressured, or manipulated. And there has to be capacity to consent. This is something you might have seen. I'll link it below, but it's the cup of tea consent video, which is amazing. That talks about the very basics of capacity consent. But it also has to do with age, power relationships, family, conscious capacity, and the overall ability to consent. So people have to be the right age. There are legal differences in every country and state. There are power relationships where it's not okay to give consent, like teachers to students, coaches to players, doctors to patients, and things like that. There are obviously family relationships where that's not okay within a context of a family. There's conscious capacity, that's the cup of tea. No one who's intoxicated can give consent, drugs or alcohol. And then the ability to give consent, so that's overall sort of maturity level, developmental ability. That's also going to be written in the law in most places. Once we have the very basics of legal, now we're looking at the evolution of understanding of consent. A while ago, we all understood that no means no. This is true. This eventually evolved, though, and became an understanding that it's not just looking and waiting for someone to say no to us before we stop, but we actually have to wait and look for a yes, that it's a red light until a green light's given, not a green light until a red light's given. So yes means yes, eventually then evolved one more time into enthusiastic affirmative consent. This is a phrase that means that someone's giving consent. It has to be, they have to mean it. They have to really look and feel and want to be there, not just say yes. You know, there's a very big difference between asking someone for consent and they go, sure, I guess, versus, yeah, awesome, or cool, let's go. Someone's got to be participating and enthusiastically giving energy back, not just passively going along with something. So affirmative consent then means this. This is an acronym that is in my book. You can see the book sort of living on the bottom right corner of each screen here. The acronym stands for hot spice. So this starts with the letter H, stands for honest. So this is each partner respectively is checking in with themselves and each other. That are they honestly wanting to do this? And then coming together and sort of checking things out with each other. The O then stands for ongoing. Consent isn't sort of a one and done moment where you ask and receive an answer and off you go and everything's done and complete. Consent's an ongoing conversation throughout any interaction. One thing that you do together requires consent, and so does the next, and any new thing that you do together from there. The T stands for talked about. Talked about means that this has to involve verbal words. This means that we can't just rely on body language, and especially we want body language and our words to match up. We don't want to be hearing one thing verbally and seeing another thing in our body language that doesn't match, and vice versa. We don't want body language to be on board, but the words aren't saying yes. They have to go together. Then we have the S is for specific. Specific means that we're giving consent to the actual thing in question. It can't be sort of a vague, hey, do you want to? And then make a face at the person. You've got to say what it is you want to do. Hey, do you want to make out? Hey, what if we do whatever? And then propose what you're actually wanting to do specifically with that person. Understanding that it has to be specific to what you're doing. So for instance, agreeing to sex with a condom on is not giving consent to sex with a condom off. That is what specific consent means. It has to be present moment. This can't mean that earlier in the day, maybe we're feeling brave and we're thinking, yeah, I think I want to, go and sleep with that person tonight. And then you end up at their house and you don't feel the same way anymore. Consent has to be reobtained in that moment. It has to be present moment. Earlier in the day doesn't count. It has to be with that person specifically. We can't give consent on behalf of other people. It has to be informed. This means that each partner has to know and has to share any risks, their actual age, their actual relationship status. Can't be like being an imposter or pretending there's someone they're not. Informed in general around what's going to occur and how it's going to go together. Consent is changeable. You can give consent in one moment and change your mind at any moment for any reason, and the other partner has to stop. It has to be enthusiastically affirmative. That means that both partners have to be there, excited, ready, and willing to be in that situation without any other pressures or any other reasons why they might be there. So what it looks like and what it sounds like. We need to understand what verbal signs of yes and no sound like. Obviously, we know yes means yes, no means no, but other things like sure and yeah are a possible yes. Obviously, no can be no, but it can also sound like I'm not sure, or I don't know, or it can even be silence. And then, of course, we need our body language signals to line up. This can be, the yes signs are pulling in, are engaging, are turning our shoulders towards each other, are, physically being there and present. You can feel someone's energy. And body language signs of no are pulling back, turning away. Sometimes nervous giggling, sometimes, again, sort of silence, shutting down, looking away. The book itself goes through a lot more specific examples. This is a very brief overview. If you want to really understand what this stuff all really looks like and sounds like, head to that book and look at each of these examples. But basically, anything other than an enthusiastic yes is a no. Hesitation, silence, and this involves only asking once. Why is that important? For these reasons here. So these reasons here are what tell us that we really have true consent. So again, we have the evolution of no means no, yes means yes, enthusiastic, affirmative consent. And then this is the last step that a lot of people are still missing that we're here to learn about today, is that this all has to happen in a context of safety. So what that means is that in a context of safety, we have the ability to truly give proper, enthusiastic, affirmative consent. And we might not always have that ability if we don't have this sense of safety. So safety has 4 different elements. We have legal, which we already went over, but we also have physical, emotional, and social. These are elements that allow our brains and bodies to feel safe so that we can truly access our true wants and desires, verbalize them, and engage with the person that we're present in that moment with. What do I mean by all that? How do we actually be present? What does that even mean? So here's why all this matters. This is a quick example that I, again, talk about in the book, but it talks about how our brains and bodies work. So very quickly, this is an image of our brain, very basic, but we have sort of these 3 layers of our brain, our most advanced evolutionary human brain on top. Inside and underneath that is our limbic system, our emotional, sort of a little bit older animalistic feeling brain. And then we have that very basic reptilian brain at the bottom and back. Our body kind of does the same thing. We have what's called a ventral vagal complex. This is polyvagal theory from Stephen Porges. This is basically our ability up here in our face, our facial expressions. This is us being mammals and humans with each other, smiling when we're happy, laughing when we're sharing a joke, looking sad or scared if we need to communicate that to someone. All happens up here. It's our social engagement system. Lower down in our body, we have sort of the starting point of our sympathetic nervous system. You may have heard what this is. This is fight or flight. This is when we don't feel safe or we don't feel okay, and our body kind of turns on the adrenaline, the feeling you get before you go on a roller coaster. Your heart starts racing, your breathing starts increasing, and you don't feel so safe in that moment. Now, one step further, we have this low down in our gastrointestinal system down there is this shutdown system. This shutdown system is a part of our body that actually goes way, way back in evolutionary times, and we actually can physically almost kind of leave ourselves, leave our body. So all this comes together in this little representation I have here, I've put together. I call it the survival house, and it has these 3 floors of the house. The top floor is that top part of our brain and body. The middle is that limbic system inside our brain. our sympathetic nervous system, and down below is that dorsal vagal complex, and that sort of ancient part of our brain, that shut down part. So when we feel safe, we have that ability to be in this top floor of the house. There's a couch there, that's where intimacy happens. The bookshelf up there is language, memory, our ability to communicate with each other, and the trophies and medals are sort of representative of this is where we want to be. The middle floor, right? Green light, yellow light, slow down, stop. There's down here is these bookshelves, these little stacks of books down there are representative of a part of the brain called the amygdala. That's a threat response storage part of the brain. That's a part of the brain that can get triggered off, and it can sort of set off this alarm that lives up here in the top floor of the house and makes us go down here in the middle floor, and it gives us fight or flight. We'll talk more about that in a second, but first we're going to visit the bottom floor. The bottom floor is one step further. If we're on this middle floor and we can't solve the problem, if we're in fight or flight and all the other stuff that happens in that floor, heart racing, adrenaline going, we're not safe, we don't feel safe. If we feel stuck, trapped, or helpless, we're going to drop one level further. We're going to go into shutdown mode. Every floor we go further away from this top floor, we're further away from those abilities. Up top, we have intimacy. If we're down a floor, we don't want to be intimate. If we're down even further, we really don't want to be intimate. Up here, we also have language on that top floor. If we're up here, we can speak, we can communicate, we can give verbal consent, which is what we need. If we're down here, in this middle floor, we're a little further away. It's a little harder to express ourselves. It's a little harder to say what we want and don't want. If we go down one level further, we may become mute. We can't find words at all. So the further away we are, the less safe we feel. And our job is with each other and with each other's partners is to help each other be up in this top floor together. So why this all matters. So we have this top floor, right? This is language, intimacy, knowledge, all this stuff, fight or flight. Now, what we didn't talk about yet, and this is extremely important for consent, is the fact that it's not just fight or flight. This whole set of activated responses that we have in our sort of repertoire evolutionarily is fight, flight, freeze, appease, tend, and befriend. And this whole host of different reactions, some different terms can also call these the fawn reactions, or these softer ones. These are de-escalating strategies. These are things that our body tells us to do without our conscious awareness. We're not thinking about this. Our body just cues us up and says, try this. And we feel this urge to respond in a certain way. And we may not always understand why if we're not familiar with the fact that our body does this. Right? And then down this level further, this is that hide and wait it out. This is that numb, dissociated, I'm not really here in my body. I'm not really part of this. And that's why verbal and body language have to go together, because if we don't have those things, our bodies can be present, even sometimes going through the motions robotically with something. But if we haven't given this enthusiastic present, that's what this top layer feels like. If we're not there, present in our bodies, then we don't have true consent. Given all this, we also have to rethink how we're teaching safety, right? I don't know about any of you watching this, but I know for myself and for most of my peers, we were all taught that if something's happening that you don't want, scream, kick, say no loudly and firmly, push the person away, maybe even slap them or shove them, or whatever you have to do to stay safe. Obviously, if any of these responses are at your fingertips and you can do them and you are feeling unsafe, power to you. Do them. Do what you need to stay safe. Absolutely. But what we don't always realize is that we are often feeling this urge to do one of those other fight, flight, freeze, appease, tend, and befriend. And if we're feeling like we have to do one of those other things to de-escalate, if we're with someone we think might get angry, if we say no loudly and firmly, we're maybe not going to do that or not feel empowered to do that. And we don't always know why we don't feel like it's safe. We start to offer these other things. We start to, when someone's asking us for sex and we don't want to do that, but we don't think if we say no, they're going to listen, they're going to respect us, they're going to not get angry at us or yell at us. If we don't feel that true sense of safety with that person, we might start to offer these other things. Okay, I don't feel like having sex, but what about a blowjob? I don't feel like having sex, but what about, if we use our hands? Even if we didn't want to do those things, we might offer them up. And that's still not true consent because we didn't truly feel safe to say no. And this is why we have to become really good at telling what does true enthusiastic body language and verbal sound like, And what might one of these, I don't know, what about this instead kind of things look like and sound like instead? So if we end up in a thing, in a space, in a moment that feels unsafe, we might have one of these reactions, okay? Often we can access those real big fight or flight in, kind of stranger danger, someone you don't know, moments when adrenaline kicks us up and over into those extreme reactions. Not always. Everyone's going to respond differently. There is no right or wrong. Consent is always the responsibility of the other person. Okay, but if you do have something happen that feels unsafe, you have to know your body might cue you to want to do one of these things. And only once you notice then your body doing one of these things, can you then try to override it. So it says there 80% of unsafe and sexual assault situations do end up happening with someone we know in some capacity. So that's a first date, a friend, acquaintance, someone that we're at a party with, someone from our class. So in those situations, we're actually more likely to go into freeze, appease, tend, and befriend. And we have to know and understand that about ourselves and teach this to each other so that we know what it looks like, we know what it feels like, and we can use better ways to override it. There's something I talk about in the book. It's by Charlene Sen. She talks about something called flipping the switch. That's the moment a normally safe person becomes an unsafe person. And one of those things that takes a normally safe person and becomes an unsafe person is when people start asking more than once. If you've said your answer and someone continues to ask, tries to change your mind, or tells you why there's another thing that you should be doing instead, that person is no longer respecting what you've said, has turned into an unsafe person, and we now have to access different ways of responding. The biggest one I'll give you right now is to just try to create space. I have to go to the bathroom. I feel like I'm going to throw up. I don't feel well. I think I hear my friend from over there, whatever you have to do to get out of that situation. Okay, when we're in a moment that's not okay, language is one of those major things affected. That's why that enthusiastic affirmative consent is so important. Without it, we could be in one of those other floors that's not safe, that's not real consent. If something does happen, it's very common to have memory and sequence of recall affected. That's that top shelf. That's where the books are all lined up with the memory, language, and order. Those bottom two floors, it's disjointed. Those stacks of books everywhere in that middle floor, and there's nothing in the bottom floor. Sometimes we don't have memory at all for certain blacking out phases in that very, very traumatic bottom floor. The last thing to understand is that cognitive dissonance might happen. If we go through something unsafe, that's not okay, that was an assault, oftentimes we'll get this thing called cognitive dissonance. That means our reality and what we believe doesn't match up, and we don't always know how to solve it. So we often will change one of the things. Either we'll change our version of reality or we'll change our belief system. It's often a lot harder to change our belief system, so we try to usually do this first. So the first thing we might do is find reasons why it doesn't count, why it didn't really happen to us. And we have to understand this when we teach consent. We need to know what the opposite looks like and what it feels like, because it's often not as clear as I think we're often taught. If someone does something wrong to you, you'll know it's wrong, go tell someone, go get help. Obviously that's all true, but it's often more complicated when you're actually experiencing it. You don't feel always like it was an emergency, the moment of the day, the minute that it's happening. Sometimes you do, but not always. So making space for everyone's range of experiences, because it's all important to do with consent. Other things to think about beyond this video, I talk about in the book. I have an online consent course that goes through all of these things too. Thinking about, as we think about consent, we can only give consent to another party when we kind of know who and what we're about ourselves. So our sexual identity, who are we? What do we want? What are we ready for? What are we not ready for? Thinking about myths and influences. This is peer pressure. This is the media. This is things that we think we believe about consent that are true, but they actually aren't. Understanding boundaries and rejection. How do we set boundaries with people? How do we stay true to ourselves? And then on the flip side, how do we deal with rejection? When we're starting our sexual lives, we're going to get rejected. It's going to happen. How do we deal with that? What does it feel like? And how do we learn to take responsibility for those emotions so we don't make it the other person's problem? Because that can turn into a type of manipulation or coercion, even if we're not intending it to. If we're putting our emotional feelings on the other person when they say no, we have to learn to deal with that ourselves. There's growing with consent. What does that look like as we mature in our relationships? And then, of course, alcohol and drugs. And then there's safer sex and consent is how, of course, contraception and other choices we might make have to do with consent and different parts that we need consent in a consensual relationship with someone. Okay, so there's more. I'm going to put all the links below this video. There's more on that online consent course. There's, of course, the book itself. I have 2 other books as well if you're interested. And if you are really into the survival house metaphor, there's another video on that as well. I'll put a link to that a little bit deeper on what it is, how our brain and body works. And you can also order prints on those. And there's lots more. If you have questions, post them below and I might make some future videos as we go.